So today we're going to talk about AngularJS directives, specifically in that context, DSL for your HTML. So who are we? My name is Lucas Rubilke. I am a senior software engineer at Web Filings. I've been doing AngularJS for about the last year. We just actually did an enterprise application that works on the desktop as well as mobile devices, and probably about 30,000 lines of Angular code. So it's a very huge, very enterprise project, and I think a couple more years I'll be on track for my 10,000 hours. I've actually contributed to AngularJS. One of those was a spelling error in the docs, but that still counts. And I'm also the co-author of AngularJS in Action. And so, who's my bodyguard here? This is Brian Ford. He is a core contributor to AngularJS. He's also a core contributor to Yeoman. Show him the jacket. Ooh! I think you get that if you're a contributor. I need to look into that. I might buy one on eBay, actually. So also, he's my co-author, AngularJS in Action. So when he found out that I'd been invited here, he actually pouted for days and days. And so finally I said, fine, Brian, you can come and crash my talk, whatever. So he wrote Batarang, which I pretty much use almost every single day. So thank you.
For the uninitiated, Batarang is not the thing that Batman uses. It's actually a debugger for AngularJS. But it's awesome, just like the thing Batman uses.
Yes, what's the difference? He also won Loveliest Hair, University of Michigan, 2011, so that's quite the accolade.
Sometimes Lucas forgets that we're supposed to be talking about software. He thinks we're some sort of comedy duo.
So speaking of comedy duo, if our resume has not impressed you enough, this is going to seal the deal right here. Brian Ford equals JoJo from Horton Hears the Who. True story, bro.
I haven't seen this movie, so this joke goes way over my head.
He doesn't get it. I've been laughing about it for like 2 days.
I think Lucas is a better programmer than he is comedian.
Wow.
So.
Woo! It's on. All right, so I don't know if you were at the previous talk. Ken did a pretty good job of going through some of the high points on Angular, so we're going to just kind of gloss over this just a little bit. But the main promise is Angular lets you extend HTML vocabulary for your application. And we're going to get into why that's really important and really useful. But first and foremost is a JavaScript framework, and Model View Controller has become pretty overloaded as of late. And so we jokingly kind of refer to Model View whatever, kind of whatever floats your boat. I prefer to think of the W as a view model. That is a pretty common pattern that seems to work well with a lot of people. And one of the upsides about a view model is that it increases your surface area to test. Before, when you had basically your state in your DOM, like how did you test that? By extracting that out into a view model, is you have more code to test, which makes better applications. So this is the supermodel, in my opinion. The supermodel of AngularJS is that you have two-way data binding that works really well. Like I said, DOM is not your model. You really want to keep state out of your DOM. Previously, for instance, like jQuery, so web applications 1.0, you would have a form, and you would click submit, and you'd have to go through and parse the DOM to actually get that model out and extract it. And it's really cumbersome, and so the idea is that you actually extract the state out of your DOM. And so this creates a nice separation between your declarative markup, your HTML, and your imperative functions, which is your view model. And it's really a more productive way to write your web apps, is that the majority of web applications written before kind of the modern frameworks that have come out, the majority of that code has been basically DOM manipulation, event handling, etc. So by cutting that out, you are writing faster apps, less code, it becomes more stable, easier to maintain, etc., etc. And the nice thing about two-way data binding is it's just plain JavaScript. You're not locking your JavaScript into kind of these special container classes, as well as there's no new API to learn. It's just JavaScript. And speaking of just JavaScript, we have templating, which is essentially just HTML. And some frameworks try to solve the HTML problem. HTML having its roots in kind of this print, background, the genesis of, in the 80s or whatever, of, basically designing for print, is that it's really limited. It's limited to what you can do. People have spent hours and hours and hours trying to work around HTML deficiencies. Well, HTML doesn't try to solve that by just abstracting it out a lot of times into an imperative context, but it actually embraces it and extends it. And so that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today is, how to embrace it, how to extend it, and as well as, because of two-way data binding, there's no redraw, there's no refresh. You don't have to manually, in most cases, kick off and say, hey, something happened, redraw the UI. Dependency injection, Ken talked about this briefly, but if you need something, that you basically declare it and you have it. So this is great as well for creating mocks. And again, it encourages testable code. Which brings me to, I think, one of the most important things about Angular is that it was written from the ground up to be entirely testable. And not only that, it's really easy to get in there and make it work. Any assertion library will do. I'm fairly familiar with Jasmine. I think in our application we have 1,000 tests or something like that. And then you also have full end-to-end testing with Karma. AngularJS it's a good neighbor. So, it's I want to use Angular for a specific thing. It plays really nice on the page. It's very well contained. It's not going to blow out your, global scope and, just tear everything up and, turn it into a frat party into your application. So, it's a good neighbor. So, that was the whirlwind tour, 5 minutes of Angular. Real quick, does anybody have any questions? All right. So what is a DSL? A DSL is a domain-specific language. It's a programming language designed specifically to express solutions to problems in a specific domain. Well, I think this definition almost needs a DSL, is that it's essentially a language that you create to describe the problem that you're in. Now, why do you need it? I'm going to jump down to the bold part here. This comes from Martin Fowler, one of the most famous, most prolific programmers / authors. I think that he knows a thing or two about programming. And he says, in particular, it may also improve communication with domain experts, which is an important tool for tackling one of the hardest problems in software development. And so you have this programmer who has seen it all, he's done it all, and he's saying that the hardest problem in software development is not, he's not saying, well, it was the syntax or this library that I learned, is that it's actually communicating with domain experts. And I think that's pretty indicative of why you would need a DSL, is ultimately it creates an efficient communication cycle, not only between your stakeholders, but between your other developers, your designers. I mean, so I'd imagine we're quite a few engineers in this room. How many people have ever went to a designer and said, I want you to build this for me? And they're just like, I have no idea what this means. Like, what is this thing supposed to do? And you get this communication breakdown. So
this also happens with programmers too.
Yes,
like Lucas
absolutely.
All the time, he'll be like, Brian, check this thing out. He'll be like, WTF? This doesn't make any sense, So this idea, I think, of a DSL is just, it's valuable on all levels because kind of the classic thing in software development is this overhead between communicating ideas between members of your team. And so as you'll see, HTML can also be kind of a vessel for improving this communication.
Well said.
Thank you.
That was elegant.
Continue.
Thank you. So I've been pulling a lot of my worldviews on JavaScript from actually Clojure. And I've had these ideas. Essentially, it's a functional dynamic language that, under the hood, under all that Java syntax is a Lisp. And so looking at other Lisp languages and seeing what they're doing, Clojure in my case has really kind of crystallized how I feel about JavaScript. And so I'm reading Programming Clojure by Stuart Holloway, and he said this point that just absolutely resonated with me. And because along with DSL, creating a DSL, you have to have a language that's flexible and pliable and that allows you to do that. And so I modified this quote just a little bit so it would make context in the sense of the slide. But he says, without the ability to reprogram the language, programmers resort to repetitive, error-prone workarounds. Literally millions of lines of code have been written to work around, and this is the key, missing features in programming languages. And I think we've all been there where, as front-end developers like, man, I wish HTML would do this. It doesn't. Ugh. And then you do some hacky thing. Java developers, I'm sure you guys have been there. It's like, if only I could get it to do this, or if I could get it to do this. I think even that's why you're seeing this kind of emergence of these, these dynamic languages with, like Clojure and, Groovy and Scala and all these different things, is it allows you to do things that the Java language just will not let you do. And so, I really think that, fixed languages in part are broken. HTML is a fixed language. Or is it?
So this is where things get pretty dramatic. So Lucas is going to just totally blow your mind here with something that you probably never expected HTML to be able to do. So there you go.
Nope.
Oh, no, okay.
You didn't see that.
1 second. You didn't see
magical.
That. All right, go ahead.
All
write
right.
the code. Write the code.
So we have this enterprise piece of software we've been working on for the last couple of days. Behold. You know what we said?
What did we say?
Said it would be so awesome. What this piece of software needs is a unicorn.
But then we were really sad because HTML doesn't have unicorns in it. But fret not, because with AngularJS we can implement it ourselves.
Let me just
or ourselves.
See can you guys see? Unicorn.
So again, there's no unicorn tag in HTML. Not even HTML5. Probably not HTML6. But
and that makes me mad. I rage about that.
Yeah, we gotta get on those spec guys on that. But here with AngularJS, we can actually. There you go. You can see it.
Unicorn.
All right, go ahead. Come on.
Behold.
Let's get the show moving.
Hey.
All right, so
Unicorn.
there you go. So you can see it. Go ahead, inspect the page, Lucas.
You know what? I will do that.
All right. So there you go. You can see there's actually a unicorn in our DOM, and inside of there's a canvas on which this unicorn is drawn. So this is a totally silly, frivolous example, but this let us figure out if you guys were still awake.
And you guys are.
And you guys
appreciate that.
So imagine a case like Twitter Bootstrap. Can you bring up like the Twitter Bootstrap site?
Sure.
Just like bring up the docs. So
we
you guys
didn't rehearse this.
Yeah, we didn't rehearse this. We're
You're
going.
scaring me to death.
We're going off the script a little. So you guys have probably seen some of like the HTML that you have to write with Bootstrap. You have like, or even if you haven't, this is pretty common in other things too, right? You have, can you go maybe components or something like that?
Yep.
Navs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like look at all this stuff that you have to write to get a nav bar. There's worse things. Scroll around until you find some really nasty HTML.
Scream if you see something gross in here.
Oh, there we go. All right. There we go. See, so you need to have all of these specific nested things like this. What if you could just, write your own class called navbar, and inside of it, it had this structure and it did the right thing. So that's one of the really cool things I think about AngularJS is it lets you fill in the holes of HTML. And unlike, some solutions that try to say, all right, we're gonna compile this or do all of this. This is all done at runtime. This is all done in an expected way with technologies that web developers in general are already pretty much familiar with.
Cool. Unicorn directive.
Tweet that. That's tweet worthy. All right. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the anatomy of a directive. Kicking Lucas out. Okay. So what exactly do you have to do to make a unicorn? or any directive, really. So there are really three main parts that we want to talk about when we want to write a directive. There's a linking function, a controller function, and the directive definition object. So here's what the code looks like for that. Right, so if you attended the previous talk, you got to see a little bit about modules. Modules are kind of boring and uninteresting, but here we're defining a directive called sample directive. We're making just a linker function, again, regular old JavaScript function. It can have scope, element, and attributes that get passed in by AngularJS as it's bootstrapping and starting and finding your directives and instantiating them. And then at the bottom here, you have this definition object. So in here, you see things like restrict, and then we are defining the linker to be this function up here and the controller to be that function there. So there we go. We saw the different things in here. There are a lot of other options as well, but again, these are the main interesting ones. So what do you do inside of a controller? Controller, you typically are modifying the objects that this particular directive owns. So imagine if you have a form, for instance, and you need to be able to enable and disable certain parts, right? That probably goes in your controller. What goes in the link function? So the linker function, or link function, is that's really where you want to be setting up your listeners and mutating the DOM and doing things like that. So AngularJS stresses really at every granularity these sort of separations of concerns. So again, linker function, fashion goes here. That's manipulating the DOM, adding listeners. Controller, that's functionality, so your business logic, mutating your models, doing things like that. And then this definition object ties everything all together. All right, so let's talk about restrict. So we saw over here restrict A. That's pretty terse. So what does that mean? So we have E for element, A is for attribute, C is not for cookie. This is Lucas writing the slides again. That's his slide. C is for class. So if you can imagine in your HTML, you can create directives that respond to attributes, that respond to tag names, like the unicorn, or that even respond to classes. And the other...
Whoa, hold on just a second.
Whoa,
You're moving way... Strict attributes, or basically the configuration options that you have, there's actually a good case for all of them. So attribute is really good is if you have a pre-existing HTML element that you actually don't want to tear down, but you just want to embellish. So I will
that's
show...
a good point, yeah. It's kind of like a mix-in, like a behavioral mix-in almost, right?
And so one example I'll show you in just a little bit is actually if you have like a combo box and then you want to turn it into like this jQuery powered thing, that's where you would use kind of an attribute directive to do that. An element directive where it actually is like, for instance, a unicorn, where it's actually an element, those are really good for kind of like components. And so a lot of people say, well, directives are components. Well, yes, to a point, that is true some of the times, where using the element tag is you kind of create these components. So for instance, Weishmo, they came out with some AngularJS kind of directives around their components, and actually like the root, like their element is like Weishmo checkbox or something like that. So now you have these kind of these reusable components that you can drop into your HTML page. Class is, I think the use case that I've seen for that is that if you are under a very strict kind of like browser specification things, is a lot of times you'll hear like, oh, well, what about the data prefix? This is not going to validate. And if you don't want to go through and put data on everything, is you can actually just move that directive call into your class and it's going to work, no problem. And so there's kind of a good use case for every single one of these. The two ones that I use the most is, am I building a component that I'm going to want to reuse? Element. Am I building, or do I just need to embellish or decorate a pre-existing element on the page? Then I go with attribute. So.
All right, thanks for cutting in, Lucas. Awesome. Okay, so now let's talk about isolated scope. So Lucas talked a little bit about reusable components. So in AngularJS, when you write a directive, it can have this scope option, which is called an isolated scope. And what that does is it prevents some directive from interacting with the outside world except in this explicit interface that you design yourself. So what that means is you can take this one reusable component and you can attach different data to it. You can reuse it in different locations. And it mitigates side effects of, for instance, if you have a guy like Lucas write some component, he's kind of a shady dude. You don't know if he's doing everything right.
I don't like where this is going.
It makes sure that it's sandboxed, right? So it's only touching the objects that you allow it to. So what does that look like? So we saw this this object here returned by our directive function, and you've seen restrict, but scope is really what we want to talk about here. So there are 3 types of bindings that you can have on a scope. There's attribute, two-way data binding, and then just this, what do we call it? Expression binding? Okay. And let's talk about each one of those then. So the attribute binding is just for simple properties that are one-way bound inside of the directive. So outside of the directive, maybe a controller, maybe some other directive that, directives can be composed of directives. So it says, I'll let you know when this is changed, and the directive says cool, and when a change happens, the directive, updates its DOM, updates some view to reflect that. Then there's the two-way data binding. Lucas likes to call this bromance, apparently, and that's I guess
that's the privilege of putting the slides together. Is
yeah,
I can do what I want.
Next time I'm doing slides. All right. So this one is let's keep each other in the loop. So if you imagine like a form that's maybe a reusable component, someone types something in the form lets the outside world know. Similarly, maybe you have some data come down from a server, maybe WebSocket, maybe you're loading something up from local storage, and you want to put that into the form and repopulate it. It can do that too. So using this two-way data binding, you can create components that act in both directions. And then the last one is expression binding. So with this one, if the component needs to tell the outside world to do something, like again, imagine a form, maybe depending on where this form is used, you want to perform different actions. Like maybe in one case, you want to just save something to local storage. In another case, you want to send a message up a WebSocket, right? So you can bind to a different expression in different contexts, and the directive itself doesn't necessarily know what the implementation is, but its parent then does. And so the parent just says, hey, let me know if you need something, and the directive says, go get me a juice box.
Which, now the parent, as any good parent, can decide how it wants to respond to that. And so you're just simply saying, go do this, and then the parent will just say, well, this is how I want to handle it. So you actually put that function that you want to call in kind of the parent scope. You define it when you actually define the directive. So,
all right, it's demo time.
I don't need this.
All right, I forgot you had your own.
I'm mesmerized by this GIF. Hold on. All right, let's get started. So do you guys want to go serious first and then silly, or silly then serious? Silly then silly, then serious. Okay. I like this.
I thought that the enterprise crowd was all serious. Come on, you guys.
All right, so let me show you what we got going on here. Oh, I love you. Okay. Many, many questions. All right. So let me show you what we are building first. So, I mean, this is representative of, like a big data structure, that would exist on the server. I'm totally just kidding. It's just balls flying around. But actually, when I sat down to build this demo, it's like, well, let's just build something totally crazy and totally funny, and and then we can kind of dial it into serious and useful later. So let me show you this code real quick. I actually, in this case, this is not a directive. I've actually just done this all in the controller. So I have an animator function, and it does all of this mathy stuff that I actually had to sit down with like high performance JavaScript and kind of pull it out and whatever. So don't worry about this. It's math. But what I do have here is, let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Can you guys see this in the back? Okay. Is I'm essentially creating an array of shapes. And then what I'm doing is I'm actually passing the shapes array into this animator function. And all it's doing is looping over and setting X and Y and whatever. And then from here, what you have is I have a div class circle, which that's how we're actually getting the circle via CSS. And then you have ng repeat, and it's saying shape and shape. So how ng repeat works is that it will actually loop over a data structure and basically create an element for every one of the items in the array, stamp that out, and then basically put that value in there for you to bind. And so as well is I'm setting the background color to shape.color, so it's actually, in the HTML, it's actually binding to this, to the color, you know, to the X, to the Y, etc. So no directives here. This is just good old JavaScript. Okay. So I'm going to jump to now this is going to look exactly the same, approximately. So now you can see I've actually created a directive called animate. And in the link function, which link is good, is basically use it to modify your DOM, is I'm saying watch the shape, and when it changes, update it to these values. So it's pretty simple. One thing worth mentioning is that AngularJS is built on top of a subset of jQuery. So obviously it doesn't make sense to put in like their Ajax stuff and, for instance, their promises stuff because, you know, we have our own implementation of promises. But at the same time, if you have jQuery already in, you know, linked in the page, is we would just defer to that. But so you'll see that you actually get scope, which is basically the present scope, and then element, which is a jQuery object for you to actually operate on. So that's really handy. And so, you know, I'm basically restricting this to an attribute, and I'm basically watching shape, and when it updates, is I'm just saying, you know, do this, this, and this. So when these properties update, do this on the page. And then you can see here, animate equals shape. So this is basically an attribute directive that I'm saying I'm going to take this div, and I am going to embellish it with superpowers. Let's go one step further.
You can just show the link function again. So
yeah.
Animate equals shape. That's referring to this link function in the animate
Mm-hmm.
in the module, and you're watching for changes in that particular shape instance.
Yep. And so setting your X and your Y, and so it's basically setting, you know, these new properties. So X and Y. And what's happening is when it sets it in the controller, is because we're passing it in. Is it saying, oh, shape has changed. What's my new X and Y? Let's go there. And so that is how that's working. And so in the controller, I'm actually, you know, looping over this array structure. So I'm ambivalent in here. All I know is I have an array structure, and I'm changing it. I'm changing properties on an array structure, and I'm, you know, in this case is, you know, I'm just setting, you know, CSS. Yes?
Scope apply at the end of your animator, I assume?
Do I have scope applying here? Nope.
He's using $defer, so that'll do the application. But that's a good point. So that's a very good question. The question kind of gets into some Angular internal stuff that are perhaps not, you know, interesting for people just looking at this right now. But what you do have to know is that AngularJS does this kind of digest cycle where it checks for changes and then updates the DOM when there are changes. So doing this, AngularJS is able to both be efficient and avoid this issue of wrapping all of your JavaScript objects so that way it can track changes to different properties and do stuff. But very good question.
And
Thank
so
you.
where you would need that?
Running that.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so there are a couple different ways that you can trigger this, right? So if you get something back from the server and then you do something with it, that might trigger this that Angular doesn't know about. You have to notify it of this change. But $defer does that for you, so you don't have to worry about it.
That's a good question, though. Okay, so let's take this a step further. And so now I've just done a variation of this, but this is just using an element tag. And so, I mean, it's pretty much the exact same thing. I am making one change here, just for fun, is instead of watching the entire object, I'm actually watching specific attributes on here. So up here is now I'm actually binding X and Y. So that's another thing about in the linker is you actually have access to the attributes of the element. So it makes actually manipulating it very easy. So in here, I'm actually watching these and then updating. So it's the same thing. Update your CSS to this and this and this. And so let's just to prove that I'm telling the truth. Righteous dude. Okay, so one more variation of this. Bear with me if you don't mind.
So you can kind of imagine this process of as you're building out your view, you're perhaps making things more complicated, and you need to really break down this sort of interactivity into more modular parts. The way that you want to tackle that is through directives. So, sure.
In this example, your tick animation thing
Mm-hmm.
is modifying shape.x.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The x equals shape.x, that's modifying an attribute, and that's falling into the code inside your link function that says when attribute x.
Yep.
I don't care about shape.x, I care about attribute x. When that
Right.
Yep.
And so,
modify
because we're binding to it, and so, we're basically watching this attribute, and we're saying when this X attribute changes, do something.
So the attributes are like a kind of informal model compared
Right.
to shape, which is more of a formal model.
And so you have it like in Angular, you have kind of explicit scope, and then you kind of have this implicit scope. So explicit scope is things that you explicitly define, scope dot whatever. But then if you use like ng model, or in the case of directives, if it's on an attribute, then that becomes like implicit scope that you can actually watch and do things. And so taking this one step further is, it's like, would it be cool if you could actually create a directive around this behavior? Because you have this big, long, like animator-like function. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we could actually abstract that out and do something with it? And so what I have is I actually created an animator directive, and I'm passing in the data structure. And so now you see that I have the ball. Same thing. All I'm doing is just watching, my attributes. When they change, then you're doing something. But then now I've created an animator directive that basically loops through and is basically just updating this data structure. So all I've done is taken, this animator function that's updating this array structure and pulled it into a directive, which is nice because now if you have basically this animation thing where, coming from like a Flash, Flex background or whatever, it's, it's really common that you'd want to share kind of similar like animation, injecting like, HTML behavior, but you're just injecting behavior and logic via a directive. So, I mean, literally, you can do anything with this, which is really, really neat. And one other thing, this is 100. Let's see what happens when we do 1,000.
So people often say, like, data binding is really slow. Why would you ever use that? Are you on the right one? That looks like 100.
Right. Oh, it totally looks the same. See, like, let me get on 04.
So there you go. That's 1,000 animated div balls in data bound in AngularJS. So this is actually pretty fast. right?
And we're not even using request next frame or whatever that is.
Yeah, this is a pretty ugly hack. So if you try just a teeny bit harder, you can make this beautiful.
Wait, what? You guys don't think this is
Beautifuler.
All right, I'll let you live. Yeah, I mean, it's not a unicorn, but jeepers.
Animate the unicorn?
I bet you I could. So that's one example. Kind of silly, but you know, it's fun. So let's do one more. How much time do we have? 20 minutes. So I'll do one more and then we'll do some questions.
So we've seen directives written with anything from jQuery UI. Here's chosen, as Lucas is going to demonstrate. D3, you guys seen this awesome visualization library? So people make charts. There's a kind of a third-party project called AngularUI. That's a collection of a lot of these different cool data-bound components. So if you're at all interested in this, check it out, because it's really easy to take your own data coming from your server, coming from WebSockets or what have you, and tie it into something like this without very much effort at all.
And so what I have here is just a simple multi-select box. You can actually click, and then it will show you, what you've clicked. And so let me just show you what's going on in here real quick. So in the controller, I'm basically making an AJAX call, and I'm saying, give me this recipient's JSON, which is just a JSON structure. And I'm just setting it to scope dot recipients list equals result dot data. Now in the HTML is, let's see here, where is, let me just magnify this just a little bit, is I have the select, and then I'm saying ng model equals recipients, and this is like ng repeat, it's ng options, recipient name for recipient in recipients list. So what it's doing is it's grabbing that structure and it's basically stamping it out specifically to a select. And then in here, so recipients is, I'm saying ng repeat, recipient in recipients. And so as you select things in the select box, it's actually pushing it into this ng model, and then it's showing up in here. So already you've actually managed to get pretty far, not really writing a lot of code, is that it's pretty handy to be able to go, well, I just want to select this guy, and I want it to show up. And so then if you actually wanted to submit this to the server, then all you would do is just, hey, server, grab this recipient's thing and send it out the door. And so on your scope, this is also an implicit scope creation, ng model. So that actually now does exist on the scope. But it doesn't look very good. It doesn't look very cool. And so let's spice it up a little bit. What I did here is, if we go to, there's a company called, is it Chosen or Harvest? It's Harvest, and they wrote a plugin called Chosen, which is this really great kind of select box where you can actually type things in, do multi-select. If you've ever done like Gmail or any like email where you start typing in email addresses and it shows up and you kind of list it out. They've done a really fantastic jQuery component for this, or a plugin in this case. And so this is one of the other features or the things that I like about Angular is it's really easy to actually pull stuff in and work with it. And so what I've done is in my linker function is I'm saying, watch this ng model. So, attributes, ng model, so that's where you have the recipients that we were looking at. And scope watch recipients list. So when this happens, when this updates, is I'm actually telling element to trigger. So element, once again, is this jQuery object. And so this is how I'm instantiating it down here. Element.chosen. So now it's spinning it up. And when I'm saying, when this recipients list is updated, trigger this thing, to tell it that something has happened. So that is one of the things that you'll actually find with like jQuery components is, going in, you generally have to like manually like refresh or update. I've actually had to go in and write refresh or update things because occasionally you'll get a plugin that doesn't have that. At the same time and this is where you'll use like $apply, is if you have a jQuery, like a plugin that does something that you need to be aware of it, or you're aware of it from a jQuery standpoint, is actually letting Angular know. So then you would say like on this update, $apply and put that in there. So this is probably one of the more common use cases for using $apply. Is something that's happened outside of the Angular purview, whether it's a jQuery plugin or you've done like a server-side call that it's not aware of. And so, it's pretty simple, like element.chosen, and then I'm just saying, when my model updates, that, do something. And so in this case, it's actually recipients list. But let me show you how easy it is to actually take a regular select and put it in here. And that's it. Let me just refresh this. Wadata. Sign on the counter line. So that's a really neat way to actually decorate your HTML, is just saying, I'm just going to wrap this jQuery plugin in Angular, and then I'm going to add it on here. So I think that actually concludes our demos. Questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, so all of your examples here just show the linker. Would the controller function be used, for example, if your directive is inside an ng repeat, so that you're setting up the scope, your scope within the repeat?
Yes.
Is there more to it than that?
Yep. Yeah, you could use it for things like that. There are cases where you might want to have a little bit more logic in there. For instance, like validation. Again, if you're making some form that you reuse, you might want to put a few little validation functions in there, like make sure this is actually an email address, make sure that this is actually a phone number. So those sort of things, you can of course put them in your linking function, but it's a little easier typically if you attach them to a scope during in the controller function instead.
So I generally divide like any kind of imperative, like manipulation type stuff, is I'll put it in the controller. And so obviously when you run examples, you kind of run this thing of like, well, I have to contrive this example so it actually makes sense without having to spin up everything. But so fashion goes in the linker, functionality goes in the controller. So it's just kind of declarative stuff versus imperative stuff. And
just to cut in a little bit, it actually gets a little bit more complicated if you have, for instance, multiple attributes on something. You might want to say, I want this guy to go first, and then this guy to make his changes, and then this. So there are more options in there, but generally, for the general case, you pretty much are only going to be using those three things that we described. But very good question. Thank you.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Outside of DSL, what's the advantage over Knockout.js?
So Knockout.js is nice. I've actually used it. So two-way data binding. It was a pretty hot girl that I used to date, but then I met AngularJS, and I wanted to marry her. So I think Knockout.js does what it does very well, but I think once you start getting into the dependency injection, the templating, the story around testability, is that AngularJS is Knockout ++, in my opinion.
Sure. I haven't used Knockout at all. With Knockout, do you have to extend something to make it observable?
Yeah, there's an observable class. So
yeah, so you have to make something. So eventually, there's a spec or a proposal or one of those things that you can't use yet reliably. That's called.
Imagine that.
Yeah, that's called. Do these type of refresh are going to end up using that, and so they'll all have this Angular-like syntax where you don't have to create this special observable thing. You don't have to make a observable array, observable object, and use all these getters and setters and stuff like that. So for me, that's the big advantage with Angular. You can make an HTTP request, get some JSON, just say, my model equals the thing that just came down the pipe. and that's all you have to do. So you can treat, your models in kind of a very, very functional, almost style programming, right? So you can say, here's my model, and then I run it through my function, and the model is just a dumb JavaScript object, and then you send it up to the server. So you avoid this kind of serialize, deserialize kind of thing that otherwise you fall into. And at least in my opinion, that makes the code a lot more concise and a lot easier to test.
And so that actually goes back to the Holloway code, that when you wrap stuff in these specialized data structures, it makes your code more fixed. Is that it's harder to pick it up and do something else with it. It's more steps that you have to jump through, and it just becomes a little bit more rigid. And so that's, for me, that's why I really like AngularJS, is because it's just JavaScript. And you're not having to learn like new APIs to, it's just dot array or, array dot push or,
right.
whatever.
So, yeah, we saw when you made those, the balls, all you did was, array dot push and all of these things, and it all got updated in the DOM. So Knockout's very cool, has some of the same features. Just the main thing I think for us is just the way that the two-way data binding is implemented. Great question though, thank you.
Next question. Don't be shy. You in the back.
Is compatibility like the same as that for jQuery?
One more time, sorry.
Is the browser compatibility the same as that for jQuery?
Yeah, the question, just to repeat it if you guys didn't hear, is what's the browser compatibility like for AngularJS? So I think we support up to like IE7, something like that. I don't know. I am fortunate enough to not ever have to load up IE7 except when there's a bug report for IE7.
So we've had web filings it works in IE 666. Things just tend to fall apart. So,
I think IE6 is declared dead though. So
yeah,
they're very. What is the share now? Does anyone know?
I don't want to think about it.
Yeah, I don't want to think about it either. All right, so the answer is if it's IE7 and above, you're probably fine. If it's IE6, I'm very sorry for you.
And actually, it's worth mentioning that directives work in all the browsers as well. So that's a big feature.
Sure. We have one more.
Just going to comment on that. Being stuck working with IE8 right now and using Firefox.
Do you need a hug?
We'll have a support group later.
Yeah.
Yep.
It seems that a lot of the directives don't.
So as the gentleman in back asked, because you're built on top of a subset of jQuery called jQueryLite, does that mean you have the same kind of guarantees? So the answer is kind of. Like you said, there are some edge cases, and there's actually a section in our documentation. Do you want to pull up AngularJS.org? There's like a nice page that explains kind of all of the little quirks in IE. But that is something that we are sensitive to because, incidentally, occasionally, we have to support IE7 as well. But very good question. And I'm hoping,
where is that?
Web dev in the enterprise world is kind of a, it's...
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of frustrating, right? Because as developers, you want to be able to use the newest and greatest, but a lot of times enterprise literally means this has to work on old IE.
Or else.
Or else, yeah. I think what we're starting to see, though, is all of the major browsers are automatically updating now. And so in a couple of years, hopefully the majority of people who are on IE will be IE10, and IE10 or 11 or whatever will be the one that auto-updates like Chrome and like Firefox. So then we won't have this kind of nasty
I think that's where they're going.
Tug of war.
So anyways, we will bring this into the home stretch. Holla at your boy. So my blog is onehungrymind.com, github.com/simpleton. I have a lot of examples. I think pretty much everything that I've covered here is in my GitHub repo. Twitter, it's simpleton. That's where you can reach me. I love to talk about AngularJS. Some resources. So you have AngularJS.org, One Hungry Mind that I've mentioned. So Brian has a pretty fantastic blog, briant4.com. And then there's one other one that's worth mentioning. John Lindquist from JetBrains is put together egghead.io. And that guy does videos like nobody else. Like, I don't even do Screencast anymore because I'm just like, what would be the point? Like, I'd be like racing to like second at best. So, but definitely check his stuff out. It's excellent. That's kind of actually where I cut my teeth on Angular. Is first and foremost, I was like, how the heck is he doing that in his IDE. So then, the offshoot was to actually learn how to use, WebStorm and, and all that stuff. So, I mean, if you really want to learn how to be efficient and do Angular, I can't say enough good things about this. One other thing worth mentioning is, obviously, we are the co-authors of AngularJS in Action. Chapter 3 and 4, it's in review. We're trying to wrap that up. Angelo has posted. We are continuing to work on that. So that is the sample application for the book. How many people have seen Trello? I mean, it is an excellent app. It's probably one of the first web apps that I saw that was just excellent. Where I'm like, this is what I want to do when I grow up. And so we are doing an Angular version of that, paying homage to Trello, and it's called Angelo. So you see what I did there? So this is definitely a work in progress. We're generating new content, constantly working very hard on it, as well as the Manning folks were nice enough to give me a coupon code. So it's 12MP25 for 42% off, and as well as I also have 3 Meet coupons to give away for the book. So catch me after the talk. Ask me a really hard question, and I'll send you his way. Ask me an easy question, and I'll give you a book. So,
thanks
thank you very much.
all of you for coming. It's a great show.
You guys have been excellent.